Hi, welcome to Conscious Living on Co-op Radio 100.5 FM in Vancouver. I'm Tasha Sims.
And I'm Marc Caron.
And today we're talking about the art of holding space, a practice of love, liberation, and leadership. Heather Plett is an international speaker, facilitator, and writer who specializes in the art of holding space. Participants of her Holding Space practitioner program work with her online on how to get comfortable with constructive, actionable practices for transforming conflict, building boundaries, and increasing sovereignty in your own life and those in the lives of others. Today, we're going to explore just what that means, holding space. We're going to look at how the practice encourages love, liberation, and leadership, which is the title of her book. And her writing on this subject of holding space has appeared in Harvard Business Review. Grist magazine has been quoted in curriculum for nurses, hospice care workers, yoga teachers, facilitators, and military chaplains. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Well, it's an important topic, we thought, and I'm curious what inspired you to actually write this book.
Well, it's been quite a few years in process. What got this all launched, this body of work launched really was almost 6 years ago. I wrote a blog post about holding space at my mom's deathbed. And that blog post went viral, has been seen by over 10 million people. And it was a real awakening to this understanding that there are a lot of people in the world that want a deepening understanding of what it means to hold space. So I've been really present with this concept now for a number of years and paying attention to what is needed in the world and what people want in terms of language for it and stories. So that's what it took me a few years to get the book out into the world. But in the meantime, I've been teaching people all over the world.
Mm-hmm. And so let's start off by defining it, because it's an interesting term and a lot of people toss it around, and I've seen it used and abused.
Yes.
So how about we start with defining what holding space actually means?
Yeah, that was one of my early challenges, is really coming to a clear definition, partly because of what you say, it is sometimes an abused concept. And I was seeing a fair bit of that. And I thought we need some really good language around it. So really what has evolved, I refer to holding space as the act of walking alongside someone without trying to change them, without trying to control the outcome, without layering your own expectations onto them, but allowing them to have autonomy to live their own narrative. And it's a practice that requires me to get my own ego out of the way. It requires me to be mindful of what's going on and to allow people to have their own lives and their own stories, really.
Mm-hmm. And it's so true, because even a helpful ego, I'm just trying to help, it could get totally in the way of holding the space, right? If you're trying to fix someone, or your intention, again, this difference between intention and impact, and what the actual impact is of what you do, right?
Yeah. So one of my early things in this work is I had to really understand holding space, I had to define the opposite of it. And the term I use for that is hijacking space. And so often when we try to give somebody advice that they're not really looking for, or we try to fix them, or we try to rush them through a process, what we're doing is hijacking. We're inadvertently hijacking their space and trying to bring some control. But that's always coming from a place of our own ego.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think this practice, which I'd love to break down and get even more into, how does it serve an expansion of love? I love the words love, liberation, and leadership. It's got a beautiful flow. Can you just give us sort of a Cole's notes of how the practice of holding space facilitates the practice of love, leadership, and liberation?
Yeah, well, those words really mean quite a lot to me. And I think there's a lot of complexity in the words. Part of the reason I like it, because love, it can be, and sometimes when we hear a misuse of the term holding space, people just think of it as a loving way of showing up. But I think if we leave love without the liberation and leadership, then it's not a fully thought out kind of love, or it's not a holistic kind of love. But when we attach it with those words, liberation and leadership, Now, if I'm really in loving service to you, if I'm going to show up and hold space for you, then I also have to support your liberation. I have to support you being autonomous, having freedom, and that means freedom for me as well as the other oppressive forces that might be in your life, and to live as sovereigns in the world, to live and treat ourselves, treat myself as a sovereign individual, treat you as a sovereign individual with your own rights, with your own emotional journey to go through. That's pretty complex relational stuff, and it's pretty challenging for most of us because we have this, there are places where our boundaries overlap and where we don't have clear sense of what's me and what's you, especially those of us who are parents, for example. We try to control our children's destiny and put the boundaries on for them without recognizing, oh, wait, this is a sovereign individual that I have to treat with respect. And if I really hold their liberation at the heart of my choices, then I have to back off a little bit and allow them to live in the way that they feel is right.
And even tolerating ambiguity, which is such a difficult thing for most people, but yet it's a sign of a highly differentiated person to be okay with saying, I don't know, I'm here, I'm with you, but I don't have your answers.
Yes.
Right? Why do you think that makes people so uncomfortable? Why do we need to know versus leaning in and developing that muscle to be able to tolerate not knowing?
Yeah. I think it's a sign of a spiritually evolved person if they can be in that space of ambiguity. I think some of my teachers, Richard Rohr, for example, is a teacher who talks about the two halves of life spirituality. And at the beginning of our lives, we want things to be really clear and we want some dualistic answers. We want there to be a good, the binary of good and bad and, good and evil and black and white and etc. But when we evolve into a higher level of spirituality and emotional development, then we have to grow this ability and this muscle, as you say, for holding the complexity. There is no right or wrong in this situation. Sometimes there's shades of gray, and sometimes there's this whole complexity that makes nothing right and nothing wrong. And one of the ways this showed up just last week, for example, I was in a conversation related to the pandemic, and we were talking about caring for the elderly right now. And this is a situation where if you're providing care, you might not be providing protection because you're exposing them to the virus. Whereas if you're protecting them, maybe you can't show up to care for them. You can't go stay in their home and look after them. So these are some of the gray areas of life. Like, it's not one or the other. We have to find ways of balancing the complexity in those kinds of decisions.
It sort of leads us to why this book is so timely in today's culture, because there's such an incredible rise of diversiveness and polarity and right and wrong, and people in extreme reactions and polarized. I'm just wondering what your take on it is, and how your book and what you're offering you think could support bringing some sort of evolution to what's actually going on right now.
Yes, I think that this is I think pandemic is offering us an opportunity to learn, to practice, to be present with what is, and to be in the space of I don't know, because none of us know how this is going to evolve. None of us know what next week is going to be like, let alone next month and next year. We don't know when this is going to shift. And so this deepening practice of learning to be present for that uncertainty and that unfamiliarity, there's a lot of discomfort in that. And I think we have evolved our culture to be one of, because we have so much capitalism and consumerism and all those isms, that we think we can buy our way into comfort. We think we can, if I just purchase the next right thing or sign up for the next right course, then I won't have any more discomfort or gray zones in my life. I'm going to get there. I'm going to evolve to that. But the fact of the matter is, life is completely the opposite of that. When we try to control it, things fall apart, and suddenly we can't be with our families, and we're stuck at home in quarantine. So It really is, I think, in a sense, a spiritual practice to be somebody who holds space, is to just lean into that. And I talk a lot about the liminal space, that space of in between of evolution, to be with the messiness of that and the discomfort.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? I know you wrote something about 21st century cults, and I was curious what you meant specifically by that term. And I think the question you posed was, do you think they're hijacking the language of the New Age and yoga culture? Can you just comment on that?
Right. Yeah, I think you're making reference to a blog post I wrote about a month ago, and this was at a time when I was seeing conversations around QAnon surface in some of these spaces and yoga communities and spiritual communities. And what I was noticing is that people were using language of holding space kind of as a spiritual bypassing language. And in other words, if I'm holding space for you, then everything is allowed in this space. I can't call you out, or I can't challenge you on your biases. I can't call you out if you're doing things that are harmful. And for
Mm-hmm.
example, something like QAnon that has surfaced in the world, people that are buying into this belief system, believing that COVID is a hoax, for example, or believing some of the propaganda around this, they might be showing up in these spaces and doing things and saying things that are quite harmful to other people. And if we only holding space as a kind of light and fairy, warm and fuzzy feeling, then all of that is allowed in this space. So one of the things that I say, and there's a whole section in my book on holding space and complexity, is we also have to be able to set the boundaries and say, when this is not allowed in this, if I'm holding space here, then I'm going to set a boundary and say, you know what, in order to maintain this space and to keep it as safe as possible for the people I hold space for, certain things will have to be left out of this space. And we are allowed to use that kind of discernment in the practice.
It's so interesting because I know I really struggled with this whole piece and felt, really, and it's good because COVID to me was like the rock got turned over and there was nowhere to run, no distraction. You're left with it. You're left with you. You're left with looking at it all, whether it's global or internal. And I think it's the same. Mm-hmm. And so I struggled with understanding how boundaries, exactly what you said, where, if you're coming from a New Age perspective, I'm interested in everybody's perspective. Mm-hmm. And yet when I could feel in my body how harmful some of the tangents were, how mean other ones were. And there were a lot of opinions flying that had impact, right, that was hurtful. And so it's not an evaluation even of right or wrong. I then went, okay, the only thing, what I'm going to hold space for was the only anchor I could find in that moment was, is this helpful or not? Mm-hmm. And helpful would mean that from a spiritual perspective, it is inclusive and supporting the dissolving of polarities of right and wrong. If it's entrenched in proving a right or a wrong, I'm completely not on board. I can't hold space for that. Maybe someone else can in a forum. It's not me. Like I knew right. Physically couldn't do that. It felt off. Yeah. But it's a really important issue because people were so shocked that it kind of lends itself to politics now too, which I'm not sure we want to go there, but it does, because it was so shocking, the people who kind of joined. You had this joining with QAnon of the religious right and the political right, and these beautiful hearts and souls that were your tribe. And it was painful. I just went, I don't get it. What's happening here? Yeah. So I love that you're commenting on it. I wonder, do you want to say a bit more? Is there anything else that?
Yeah, it's a very puzzling time and very complex. And it's a time when so many of us that are, I count myself kind of on the fringes of that kind of community. I'm not deeply embedded in a New Age community, but certainly on the fringes of it. And it's a time when I sense people are really afraid of offending other people that they genuinely care about. And at the same time, one of my value system, and this is deeply embedded in my work, is that I'm going to work to center those that are most marginalized by a situation. So sometimes that means that the protections I put up are going to be in service to those who have most potential to be wounded by something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's maybe not my discernment to decide if something is right or wrong. But if I notice that some conversation that's really filling up the space that I'm in, I notice somebody being harmed or wounded or potentially done wrong by that situation, then I'm going to stand up to it. And when I think of this, for example, I have a daughter who is disabled, living with a chronic illness. And that when she, for example, is at more risk than most people of COVID, it could potentially kill her. Mm-hmm. And so when I think of her as one of the people that I would center, and I'm just saying this in my family, when we make decisions about how much we're going to be outside the home, how much we're going to be exposed to COVID, we're making decisions with her at the center of that decision. Mm-hmm. So that's what I tell people. If you're hosting spaces and you're letting everything be whatever, anybody wants to talk, say whatever they want, are you noticing who's being harmed by that conversation? And so if somebody is a person with a disability, somebody is racially different than others in the room, if someone is marginalized because of gender issues or whatever, are you noticing how that person is being harmed? So it's not so much about me now, it's about the person with the least amount of privilege, the most amount of marginalization and oppression in the system. Can I pay attention to what their needs are?
Mm-hmm. And when you say you stand up to it or you enter it, I guess would be another way of saying it. I mean, most people tend to want to avoid conflict. Like right. They're quite afraid of it. And I think you used a term of transforming conflict. Yes. Maybe you could just pick that apart a little bit and go, so how would you do that? So even if you felt afraid, and you might, you're still going to speak. What makes the difference between, how do you transform conflict? Maybe that's a simple way of asking.
Well, I'll say up front, I don't love conflict. I don't know of anybody that does love right. conflict, but conflict can be very generative and it can help us create something new if we're willing to walk through it with each other and hold it with respect and tenderness. If I can walk into a situation where there's conflict and I can say, okay, what does this want to reveal?
Heather, we're just losing your sound a little bit.
What's new that can grow? And how are you?
Well, Marc, was that everywhere or just...
Yeah, it garbled a bit there, yeah.
Could you just repeat your last thoughts there?
Sure. What was the train of thought I was just on?
I couldn't hear it. But the big question was transforming conflict. And we were talking
that's where we were going. Yeah. So yeah, I was talking about how if I can hold conflict as a possible gift that has generative qualities to it, then I can start. I have a friend, for example, who uses a lot of gardening language. Conflict is kind of like breaking up the soil and preparing for something new to grow. So sometimes we need a little bit of that disruption to show up in the system that will indicate where are the gaps in the system, where are the gaps in the way we treat each other, how are we treating each other poorly. This is a, it takes a lot of work and a lot of practice to view conflict like this, but it can build something newer and stronger and better if we are willing to have some patience with it and willing to be respectful in how we meet each other in conflict.
I love the metaphor. It immediately puts a positive reframe, and there's a reason that you're entering the so-called fray, because there's something new that wants to be birthed out of that soil. That feels tremendously exciting. Whereas when you think most people are trying to put out the fire or something, like dampen it, get it down. It's out of control. Like there's this panicky feeling, and that doesn't feel expansive or worth entering. Why would you enter? It kind of, brings me to the whole fight, flight, freeze. And there was another blog you wrote that I really want to talk about. I know I'm sort of dovetailing quickly into it, but it was so important. You talked about a fourth response, and that was your story. I wonder if you would tell us the story of Mr. Big Man, you called him. That's how it came to you. And then how you found this fourth response to trauma and what it is, because I just found that fascinating.
So I've been studying this now for a couple of years. There's this fourth response that's emerged in the literature, and there is some scientific papers that have been written about it. And it's called Tend and Befriend. And the story that you're referring to, this is a trauma response that shows up in me, and I notice it more and more, especially now that I have the language for it. And the story you're referring to, I was driving home, and there was a man in a big pickup truck, and that's why I called him Mr. Big Man, because he just had this presence, the big pickup truck, behind me, impatient, wanting to get past me. I was driving speed limit, coming up to a stoplight, and I could tell he wanted me to rush the stoplight. It had turned yellow. I pulled to a stop because I was a good law-abiding citizen, but he was behind me, and I could just tell by his body language that he was impatient, wanted me to rush it. And we were both turning right, but there was no right turn on red. And I was sitting there anxious and worried about what he was thinking, worried that I was getting in his way, wanting to look after him, even thinking about pulling into the intersection so he could turn around,
Right.
all of these things to look after his emotional experience in that moment when it really had nothing to do with me. And he had to, but this is what the trauma response, and they're finding more and more evidence of this showing up. And it's partly because earlier in the days of researching trauma, they were focusing more on men's experience and rather than women and gender non-binary people. And they now, as they expand the research, they're realizing, oh, wait a second, there is this tendency to look after everybody else, to tend, and what it is you're tending the most vulnerable in the situation. So it tends to be a parenting kind of thing too. Who else looking around? Who else do I need to look after? And then befriending the person who is the perpetrator of the harm. So having this awareness, when you start to notice it in your body and in your system that you're reacting to that, it's really been quite revealing for me.
It's amazing because especially that immediately you're wrong, you've done something wrong. That's the reenactment of the original trauma happening in your body. Like I'm driving the car, and you're doing speed limit, but your body's responding as if you're at fault. And then you must appease the perpetrator. And so can we just weave this because there are people in this situation on the daily. It's so normal for them in a situation where you're being emotionally or physically abused, and yet you stay. And I've worked with people in that situation, but I also constantly hear people saying, why don't they just leave? I don't get it. Mm-hmm. And this one, to me, more than fight, flight, or freeze, I went, well, it's a trauma response. And there's some relief, I think, when you can own it and land it and go, okay, this isn't me. This isn't my personality. This isn't my essence. This is a trauma response. Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, for sure. And I say right up front, I have so much compassion for anybody in this situation, in an abusive situation, because it is far more complex than many of us know. And there's a really great book I recommend. It's called Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, and it's about attachment systems and trauma. It's specifically about cult systems, actually, how cults keep people hooked, but it's also really about how in abusive situations they keep people hooked. And what happens actually in that situation is you grow a trauma bond develops between the perpetrator and the victim, and partly because the victim ends up in this heightened state of awareness. So your nervous system is kind of always flooded. You're always alert. And so it's like you're in permanent trauma state. So all of your decisions, like you can hardly ever access the higher thinking part of your brain because you're stuck in that heightened alert, because it's trauma bond, and this based on attachment systems, the whole attachment theory. what happens is the perpetrator, and what they're talking about largely is cult leaders, but also abusers, relationship abusers, they become both your source of security and your greatest threat. So there's this warring part of you that thinks this is the only place I'm secure, but this place is really dangerous for me as well. So you're kind of always in this, your brain doesn't know what to do with those two pieces of information simultaneously.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to check out that book. I find that whole, we've done a few interviews on NXIVM, and Sarah Edmondson we had on the show. And I think there's something so important to understand about what's happening, what happens in a cult, what happens in relationship, and what's happening in the world globally. There's and let's go back to holding space, because if part of holding space is that you're holding space for liberation and the person's own autonomy, in all the situations we've just mentioned, it doesn't exist. That's not what is the driving climate, right?
So there's a couple of pieces to that. And so one of my, the core teaching around holding space, I talk about being the bowl. And the bowl is really the container of how we hold the space. The bowl doesn't put a lid on it, doesn't control the space. It just offers that place of safety and security and support. And one of the things early on when I started teaching about holding space, I would talk about creating non-judgmental spaces. So that's one of the offerings that you make to another person, is you show up with non-judgment. But I have since evolved that. And if you read my book, I now use the language of selective non-judgment, because we can't entirely remove our judgment from a situation, and we shouldn't, because there are times when we need to step in and be a little more directive. Or there are times when, for example, if somebody comes to me and tells me that they've just broken the law, well, I'm going to want to help them, support them in reporting themselves or turning themselves in. I can't be totally non-judgmental and just say, oh, that's okay, that's fine, no problem. So I've added the language of discernment to that as well. You have to use your discernment. And for example, if you are encountering somebody who's ended up brainwashed and in a cult, you're going to have to use some discernment in how to speak to them. You're not going to want to completely just leave them to their own devices, because now there's a control mechanism in place that is actually brainwashing them, and there might need to be disruption in that case. So I say that there's a time for holding space, and then there's sometimes a time for more directive action. And another kind of simple example I use is, yes, I want to hold space for my children, but if I have a small child that runs into traffic, that's not a time for holding space. That's a time for grabbing that child and pulling them off the street. So you have to use your discernment about when another action is needed.
Yeah. What do you think that it is that makes people so afraid of some of these messy conversations and just tolerating big emotional conversations? What is it that makes people so nervous or uncomfortable about that?
I think we have this illusion of control. We have an illusion that we can control our own emotions and that we can control other people's emotions. And it's like I say, it's an illusion, and we're socially conditioned for this, I think, in our education systems, in our ways of being raised in our culture. And I remember I had a good friend who was from South Africa, and then she moved to Canada for a few years, moved back to South Africa. And she said, I'm looking forward to going back to South Africa, because that's a place where people are okay with the grit and they show their grit. And she said, in Canada, you seem to want everything cleaned up, and you're putting on this front of everything having to look nice and be clean.
Yeah.
And I think I really agree with her. In our culture, we have developed this facade of having things under control. And so, especially in an era of social media, we think we need to portray this put together persona. Meanwhile, we might be falling apart inside. And there's vulnerability in revealing that to each other. And that's a real practice that we have to show up with each other, be willing to be in those messy places of relationships so that we can begin to reveal those. And really, if I'm uncomfortable with your big emotions, it's a pretty good sign that I'm uncomfortable with my own emotions. So we have to start there, is how do I hold space for my own emotional experience so that I have capacity for yours?
Which I really want to segue to, because it's a lovely thing to hold space for others. And as you're pointing out right now, it would be impossible to do that if you're not doing that for yourself, right? They're
Yes,
completely
exactly.
interconnected. So let's see if we can do and offer our listeners some practical steps or tips on how you begin to hold space for yourself, especially if you're aware that I think judgment, self-judgment, that inner critic, that voice that's always telling you you're not quite doing it right or good enough, or that in itself is so problematic for almost all people. Do you have any guidance or practical tips around dealing with that inner critical voice?
Yeah, I love the language of, I think it's Christopher Germer, who talks about uncommon kindness. You have to extend uncommon kindness to yourself. And that's really where this starts, is practicing speaking to yourself in the kind of voice that you needed when you were a child. So what is the voice that a caring mother would offer a wounded child? We are all wounded children inside, and we all want love, and we all want to be accepted and needed and have a space of belonging. So start there. Start by talking to yourself with a different tone of voice. And you can do that. One of my favorite practices is my journal. I do a lot of journal writing, and I will even have conversations with my higher self. Like, I'll write it like a dialogue. I'll write what's on my heart, what I'm, if I'm frustrated or I'm feeling hurt or something, I'll write that out. And then I'll have another voice come in there and be the soothing voice and offering a different perspective on this. Have you thought of this? Almost like an internal coach or something like that, somebody who can listen. So look for those practices. And I think everybody needs some mindfulness practice too, that we can just pay attention to what's showing up and practice releasing it. And that's one thing I say is, like, get curious about what's showing up, and then do something that actually lets you release it. And that might be an actual physical body movement that says, you know what, I have a lot of anxiety in me right now, a lot of tension, I have whatever that is. What can I do that opens me up, that actually creates openness to release it, to send a signal to my body that I'm letting go of this anxiety right now?
And learning to trust. Again, I guess the question I want to ask around that is, what are you trusting? Let's start with that, because when people think of trust, they think, well, do I trust myself? Sometimes. Do I trust other people? Depends. Like, it's so conditional. And I wonder if that's trust, how you see trust, and what you would define that you are being called to trust.
So earlier I mentioned that the bowl is the model that I use for holding space. And it's really got 3 layers, this bowl. And the inner layer is what I offer to other people. So that's compassion, that's support, that's the selective non-judgment piece. And then the middle layer of that bowl is what's going on inside me so that I can offer it. That's my discernment, that's my intuition, that's my curiosity and my courage. It's all the qualities that I'm working to foster so that I can offer it to other people. Now, that doesn't happen without an outer layer of the bowl. And in the outer layer of the bowl, I've got just two things, and they are mystery and community. And mystery is the term that I use for whatever your spiritual support is. And I don't want to be dogmatic, so I don't necessarily, you can insert your own language, and that might be God, it might be goddess, it might be spirit, it might be earth or universe, it might be the natural world. I love to go out into nature and really feel held by the natural world. I have some favorite trees that hold space for me. And other people have pets or whatever that world is. And then the other part of that is community. And this is something you have to really work to foster. If you're going to get good at this work and strong in this work, you have to have circles of support. So it might be your close circle of friends. It might also be your therapist or your coach or your yoga teacher, whoever is holding space for you. And that's where developing trust, one of the things I say in this bowl, because I was debating, where does trust go? And I realized that trust is like the glue that holds it all together. It's between every layer. Like, we have to trust in mystery and community to hold us so that we can do this work. And then we also have to trust ourselves at that middle layer. And then I have to trust you in order to hold space for you, and vice versa. You have to trust me. So it's learning it at all levels, internally and in relationship, and then to the external, broader world.
And I think such a difficult process if you've gone through a lot of trauma, because that's the first thing that goes. Nothing is, you have no idea anymore what is solid and what is not when you've been severely or even on any level traumatized. I think that's what gets shook to the core.
Yeah, and it may be that before you can lean into trust, you have to do a lot of healing work first, and really learning to speak of your trauma or to heal it through your body practices. But unfortunately, it goes hand in hand. You can't get into healing without at least a little bit of trust.
Right.
So you see people show up. Sometimes I did some work with an organization called EGALA, Equine Assisted Growth and Learning Organization. And so they work with horses, and they have a lot of success, a fairly high success rate with returning veterans who come back with PTSD. And what they have learned in their practice is that a returning veteran has a really hard time trusting people, especially with their PTSD. To speak about PTSD, especially when you come back to a culture, to a group of people who know nothing about what you survived while you were in a war situation. But what they found is that these veterans can develop trust with horses, and they don't have to speak. They don't have to try to articulate what's going on, but the horses will hold space for them. And they say it's one of the most successful healing modalities when it comes to PTSD. So take baby steps. Like, can you trust in a situation like that where it's more animal-based healing, or, in a yoga studio where you don't have to talk to anybody yet, but you can trust your body? What's your first step into the healing? And it kind of goes hand in hand. Like, it's taking one step into trust, another step that allows you to step into healing, which allows you to step into more trust, and in that way you move through.
I love that. I love what you're saying. And as you're speaking, I also just had the visual of there being many roads to trust, like many ways to, if trust was at the core, we all have our own path in. And I certainly have found, being a master dissociator, to have survived, it made me very comfortable having spiritual experiences. I could trust that. In other words, I could trust nothing, like more than I could people. That sense of connection to something vast that's everything and nothing, to me, was home, versus the complexity and confusion with people. So everyone, and this path with horses, or whether it's nature, it's like opening to, I love the way you said it. It was just very inclusive and gentle, many ways to learn. But if without it, you're not on that journey of healing, because where do you go? If the opposite of trust would be in vigilance, constant vigilance, because the universe somehow is not a friendly place, right? Yeah. Go ahead, Marc.
I just want to make a comment on that, because I know, I've sat in many group work and in different environments where, when people are allowed to share openly and they have that trust, it's amazing to hear, their story of what may have happened, or what their trauma, or what they're working through. And it's equally as impactful and moving when you actually see the shift in them. And, I've sat in some circles where, people have shared something they haven't told anyone in 65 years because they haven't felt safe enough to share it. And then they'll share it in a group of strangers because they feel safe. you know. And I think it's finding that place where we can speak our truth and have that open honesty and know that you're not being judged or being accepted and appreciated for your unique human experience. And that to me always becomes such a powerful environment when you're holding that kind of space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's why we have to really work on trust building. And that's what I teach, because I teach people who end up becoming facilitators and leaders in this work. And becoming trauma informed is really critical, to understand that those people that show up in the room that might be resisting you, and they might be putting up a lot of like masks and barriers, etc. That's a good chance that's trauma showing up. It's not necessarily that they don't like you. It's just that they've got trauma running through them that makes this feel unsafe. So you've got to work to actually support them and feeling more and more safe so they can open up and share that story, as you're saying, that they haven't told anyone in years. But that takes intention and commitment and presence. And that's really what this holding space work is. How do we consistently keep showing up that allows people to soften into it and realize, oh, maybe I can speak my story here. Maybe this is a place that offers that container.
Mm-hmm. And even if we're all different, and that to me is another, I've done group work, led group work for about 20 years. And what I really, it took me a long time to understand how it can go awry, even if you don't see it, because it looks like a loving group and there's space for everyone and everyone's sharing. But that in itself becomes a noose that keeps people from saying something different, because they are different, because they feel differently. So there's, instead of groupthink, we all think like this, even if it's loving and wonderful, the freedom to be you is something that's so important to include there, right?
Yeah, and that's why one of my language that has evolved in this is I used to, in the early days of hosting retreats and workshops in various circles, I would talk about creating safe space. But I've actually evolved that, and I now talk about holding brave space, because I realized that we're putting all this focus on creating safety. And for one thing, safe for me is not the same thing as safe for you. So whose definition of safety is going to be at the center of what we're doing here? For another thing, sometimes safety is equated with comfort. So what we're really trying to do is create spaces where we're all comfortable and nobody's disrupting us. But if nobody disrupts us, we're not going to grow. It's like what I said with conflict earlier. Like if there isn't a bit of disruption now and then, we're going to stay where we are. We need some disruption for that growth to happen. So when I hold a retreat, I will talk about, okay, what does brave space mean, and how can we show up? We're going to do our best to help you feel safe, and then we want you to take brave steps into some growth or healing.
Mm-hmm. And when you use the term showing up, because that's another one that's used all over the place, let's define it. Let's give it some words. What does showing up mean to you?
Well, I think it means a whole variety of things. I think when somebody shows up, I think they have made the courage to step into the space. So it's possible that they're showing up with only as much as they're ready to reveal in that moment. Maybe they can show up a little bit more fully if the trust is built. And so showing up is, I think, an iterative process, really. Like, I'm ready to show up this way. Tomorrow, if I trust you a little bit more, I'm willing to show up a little bit more. And I'm going to keep working to expand, to grow my vulnerability so that I can be more and more authentic in this space.
Mm-hmm. And how does all this work? Let's shift a little bit globally. We've got some minutes left I'd like to look at the world. And how do you work with systemic issues? How do you know how to hold space when there are such deep systemic issues that are relevant in today's world?
Yeah, that's such a big and complex question. So I mentioned that my book has 3 parts, and the last whole section is on holding space in complexity, because first of all, I don't know when I step into a space how much complexity is going to show up, how much systemic issues are going to show up. It might be that there's going to be racism in the space that I totally didn't expect. It might be there's gender issues, etc. So one of the things that I try to do is really keep myself informed and aware of what's going on globally, and as much as I can. Of course, I'm not going to read all the news or overwhelm myself, but I want to be present so that I know who's hurting in the world. Again, it's like I said earlier about who am I centering in this conversation. So I'm paying attention to where's the woundedness showing up in the world. For example, back in the spring when Black Lives Matter, there had been a number of police shootings. That's really present in every space you're going to host. So that has to now become you have to be prepared to hold space for that if it's going to be in the spaces you're hosting. So having some awareness, paying attention to what's the energy field going on. And then you don't need to know everything. You don't need to be an expert on social justice. But if you have some awareness and if you understand it, it's also paying attention to what are my own biases, what are my own blind spots. And if I hold space for myself well, then I can be present in a situation where somebody's going to challenge me because I have a blind spot or a bias. I'm not going to fall apart in that moment if somebody does challenge me, because I have the capacity to hold that mindfully and not get shattered by it, and actually learn from it and grow from it. And just like we said with conflict, maybe this is an opportunity. Mm-hmm. This is the brave space that we're being invited into to recognize and speak of some of these challenging things.
And so there was a response at the beginning. You would hear Black Lives Matter, and a number of people would say all lives matter. Mm-hmm. Can you use that example and apply it to holding space, or how you feel, how you perceive that response? Is that, I think in those moments, yeah. Well, that's my opinion. I want to hear yours. Go ahead.
Well, what I hear in those moments is a defensiveness. When people need to jump to all lives matter, they're not willing to hear the wounds of a particular people group. So they want to jump to, what about me? You know, you're not centering me in this. But the problem is a lot of us walk in the world with privilege. So we're the center of the narrative all the time. And so when we want to take away that pain, or we want to brush over it by saying something like all lives matter, then we're ignoring the deep wound, the deep historic wound that people are trying to express. And similarly here in Canada, with the Indigenous peoples in Canada, if we're just going to brush over, that was 100 years ago, let's get over it, let's move on, then we're really trying to ignore the deep generational historic wound that people are trying to reveal to us. So I need to learn to silence my reactivity. I might be feeling defensive in that moment, but if I can silence my reactivity and invite that story into the space and say, please tell me more about what you're saying with this. Please help me see the wound so that we can heal this. We can be in collective space. We can make repairs if we need to, and hold space for what can be possible here.
Beautifully said. Thank you. We only have a few more minutes. I want to make sure people know where they can find out more about you, where they can get your book, and any upcoming events that you've got.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I can be found at heatherplett.com, but more importantly, right now we have a brand new site that we've just evolved called Center for Holding Space. So centerforholdingspace.com. And you can order my brand new book there. It just came out in September, The Art of Holding Space. We also we've just developed a deck of cards, the Holding Space card deck. And those who are looking visually can see they're beautiful round cards, which is kind of fun.
Oh, pull one right now for this interview, for this moment. Let's do it.
A card.
And give us an example. We love cards, don't we, Marc?
Yes, we do.
So this is a deck of 52 cards. You can pick one every day of the year, and they're all based on the themes of the book. And the card I pull for you is invite joy. What if joy, ease, peace, and fun are invited into the space?
Yay.
I know
Okay.
Joy.
I'm
I'll
in.
invite her.
That's beautiful.
No, that is
Good
great.
one. So,
Well,
and we also have other courses, everything at Center for Holding Space. I'm just developing a brand new course on holding space for yourself in times of disruption. So that'll come out in the next month or so.
Awesome. And I know, Marc, you've got it all up on the Facebook interview, and then we'll have it on our webpage on consciousliving.radio.org.
absolutely.
Wednesday night, 6 to 7 p.m., where you'll hear this interview again, and then available for podcast at www.consciousliving.radio.org. Any final thoughts from your heart to the world? What's the message?
You know, I think we have capacity for this strange time, and we need to trust ourselves and trust each other and lean into the relationships that matter right now.
Lovely. Well, it's been delightful speaking with you. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heather. No, that was fantastic. You're covering so much great stuff, ladies, that I was mesmerized, and there's so much I could have thrown in, but it was just one great question after another, and I think it's just really timely. And what I loved about what you're talking about, Heather, specifically was, that whole conflict piece. Because so often people get into conflict, and, you were talking about, the sovereign and how we respect things, and even with the world today, Vancouver's got these freedom rallies going every week. And a funny story where a woman was commenting on the Facebook video that they'd done the live on, and her son had gone down to check it out to see what was going on. And so here's all these people about freedom, and he was wearing a mask, and then they mask shamed him. And it's kind of like what you were talking about, this hypocrisy in how we do things, because everybody wants to be right. And I just love that, non-judgment and really just accepting everybody. So it was really, really great conversation, ladies. Just happy to be part of it. And I think there's a lot of great stuff that our viewers and listeners will really value, because it's such an important part of what's happening today is, allowing people to be free and be mindful, and then to bring joy, peace, and love into our life with your card. Couldn't end any better, really, I think, because that's what we really need to remember is in this present moment, we can bring that in at any time.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us. We've been speaking with Heather Plett. The Art of Holding Space, a Practice of Love, Liberation, and Leadership is her latest book. Go onto her website. You can check it out there, or at Conscious Living Radio. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.